Welcome everybody to the Transforming Assessment Series webinars. This is we're in November, so we're almost finished our year. Today's session is by Professor Sue Bloxham from the University of Cumbria in the UK. This is a special joint preview session for the Assessment and Higher Education Conference as well. The topic today will be the multiple limitations of assessment criteria. So Sue, would you like to begin, please?
Okay. Good morning to everybody, wherever you are in the world. It's great to be speaking to you here. I'm particularly proud of anybody who got out of bed like I did at the crack of dawn for this. I just need to say this is the first time I've done one of these before, so I'm doing my best, and I really will make an effort to try and build in discussion and respond to conversation or encourage people to talk to each other about the things that are raised. Please do feel free to put any questions you want in the chat room or put your hand up, as Mathew just explained, at any point, but I will build in some specific times. Okay, that's what I've just been talking about, getting the hang here. So I'm talking about the multiple difficulties with assessment criteria. And just a little background, I imagine if you're involved and interested in this seminar, you're also somebody who probably is reasonably au fait with the use of assessment criteria. But they've been introduced, in my experience, over the last 20 or so years in higher education at different times, I think, in different national systems. But the idea is that they make the processes and judgments of assessment much more transparent to staff and students. You know, they reduce sort of arbitrariness or subjectiveness of staff decisions. And underpinning their introduction really has been the assumption that explicit criteria, if they're written down, they become accessible to everybody involved, perhaps with a little bit of help for students, but they become accessible to everybody. And as Harvey said, I think Harvey's out there today, I think I just saw him join earlier, writing it 10 years ago now, over 10 years ago, that certainly in the UK context, to provide assessment criteria has become regarded as something you just have to do, there's no question about it. And there are lots of benefits, perceived benefits to it. So, for example, Roy Sadler talks about providing for ethical practice, guidance for students, more objective marking, communicating feedback, helping students learn. And my experience is, and in some of the literature, that students and staff do like to have them. They give them some sort of security or sense of control over what they're doing. But the reality is that we just do not have the research on them. They're founded for the most part, their use is founded for the most part on argument and assertion, really, rather than empirical inquiry. That, I think, is an important issue. So, just moving to the next slide. In this seminar, then, I'd like to look at research, drawing on research I've done recently with colleagues and other research, to explore the use of assessment criteria by experienced markers and discuss the implications of that for fairness, for standards, and for guidance to students. So just what it says there, that's the plan. Okay. If you look at the literature on marking in higher education, it is absolutely full of evidence, well, there haven't been enough studies really, but those studies that they have tend to really reinforce poor reliability and consistency, poor consistency of standards, where people are assessing the kind of complex performance that we associate with higher education. And I just listed a good number of the studies there, and there'll be a reference list. We'll record the reference list at the end for everybody who wants to follow anything up. In a way, it's reasonable to expect this, because when you look at the research on academic judgment, it really does consistently emphasize the sort of individualized, tacit, interpretive nature of standards. So in lots of ways, it's to be expected that reliability would be low. You know, the less standardized the assignment, the more opportunity there is for students to answer things in different ways, the more open-ended they are, the less likely we are going to be able to come up with reliable judgments on it. So that's something that is there in general background. When people have looked at the causes of inconsistency, quite a lot of different reasons come up. And again, just looking quickly at these, different people's different professional knowledge, their experience, their values, their sort of career and what they've experienced, the marking they've experienced, perhaps the students they've worked with, influence them, such that, as Wolf argued, they develop different marking habits. And we, in some work did a few years ago, talked about people developing their own standards framework, a sort of lens through which they looked at students' work, which does seem to be influenced by their prior experience and knowledge and values. Values is quite an important element there. But there are other more sort of concrete things that come out. One is that people have different expectations of standards at different levels. So in other words, what you might feel is satisfactory in relation to some particular criteria, another lecturer might think is weak, or another one might think is very good. So there's that notion about what constitutes standards that differ. Also, there's evidence that people just choose not to use the criteria, either in a kind of deliberate fashion because they don't like having them imposed, but more so in our research is that they just feel they know what the standards are, so they don't feel a need to look closely at what has been written down. There's some evidence that people interpret the criteria differently, so again that links to this different knowledge and experience and values, and that clearly is going to impact on variability. But also people, as well as ignoring the published criteria, tend to use personal criteria different to those that are stated. One criteria, different to that's stated because they think it's more important or whatever. People give importance to different criteria and they focus on different aspects of student work. So that's what prior research seems to be throwing up about inconsistency, and there may be other reasons. So I just thought now would be a moment to just think about this. So just using the poll, so we have to start off with, I just wonder whether people would say yes or no to whether this kind of inconsistency in marking matches with their experience. Well, I don't know whether this is visible to everybody else, but we're getting quite a high number of yeses there. Would anybody like to comment in the chat box or make a comment, put their hand up to make a comment about your experience of reliability and standards and marking, and whether assessment criteria have been helpful? There's one person who has felt that they don't recognize that this inconsistency. Okay.
Hi, Nikki. Nikki, can you hear us? You've ticked no, so we're very fascinated to figure out why you ticked no, or maybe you're just being inconsistent with our criteria. Oh, it's gone. Maybe it was a mistake.
Ah. Oh, okay. 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 One of the interesting things I find when I work with staff is that they often say that they agree on marks. You know, when they get together to moderate marking, they often say they agree on marks, which is interesting in itself. I have to say, where people have done sort of more controlled studies, they don't replicate that finding in general. But one of the reasons may be that there is an agreement at the sort of overall mark level, but perhaps that's masking underpinning differences about different elements. We don't know, just because we both agree that it's a B or a C or a distinction or whatever, why it gets that.
Nikki's put up her hand. Do you want to let Nikki ask a question via the voice chat?
Yeah. Please do, please do.
Okay, Nikki, so if you'd like to press the talk button up in the upper left-hand corner, you should be able to use your microphone. Nikki, we're not getting any sound coming through. We can see that you're pressing the button, but unfortunately there's no sound coming through. Would you like to type your question perhaps into the text chat or comment in the text chat? Okay, so you can continue. Nikki, type into the text chat.
Okay, I'll continue. So, what I'm going to talk about now, this is part of a wider study on standards as they're used by experienced assessors in higher education. These people's level of experience had enabled them to be appointed as an external examiner in the UK context, i.e. to go along and check the standards and comment on the standards of programs in another university. Now, some of this work I presented before, but this is a sort of further analysis that comes from it. But the one or two slides at the beginning, those who've seen it before might recognise. So we were interested really to look at the consistency of standards between examiners and within and between disciplines. And we wanted to really look at the roots of the similarities and differences in standards that were used in marking. Just to mention here, this was part of a joint project with colleagues I've listed there at Oxford Brookes University, Professor Margaret Price, and two brilliant research assistants, Jane Hudson and Birgit Danuta. Okay, so the method we used was we sourced 24 experienced examiners. These people were volunteers at 4 disciplines, so that was chemistry, history, psychology and nursing. So we were looking for contrasting disciplines and also from very diverse UK universities, from sort of elite Russell Group universities and at one end and sort of brand new universities at the other end. And each of these lecturers was given in advance 5 borderline assignments. Now, I guess in the Australian context, they're borderline BC, 2122 in UK. Maybe that would be distinction credit borderline, I think, in Australia. They were given borderline assignments, but they didn't know what the marks were on them, and asked to mark them, look at them and make notes as if they were marking. And then about a week afterwards, we had an interview where we used Kelly's repertory grid technique to try and actually focus on what they did to elicit the constructs. In other words, the way they thought about the student work at the moment of marking. So it wasn't asking them what they did in their marking, but to try and actually elicit, and I'll try and come to that. The reason we used Kelly's repertory grid was because it's a very useful technique for accessing people's tacit knowledge, their personal meanings. And in general, it's that tacit knowledge of standards which is so hard for us to get at, generally speaking, when we're talking about research, and maybe not even be aware of ourselves particularly. And there have been other studies that have used this method, generally with secondary education, but it was seen as good at eliciting how expert assessors perceive the abstract demands in work. So to give you an illustration, this is a Kelly grid, and I'm sorry it all looks a bit complicated in front of you, but I'll try and explain quickly. This is one examiner's grid. If you, they had 5 different assignments, so across the top you'll see A, B, C, C, D, E, A, B, E, B, C, D. Those are combinations of 3 different assignments that they were asked to look at. So at each stage, 3 different assignments were put together. So the one that's highlighted, the dark blue one, A, B, C, those 3 assignments, they were asked to say how 2 of them were similar in the way that the 3rd one was different. And the similar construct was then written in the left-hand column. So if you can see the first construct, when looking at A, B, C, this particular lecturer said that they thought 2 of them had excellent argument And then if you look at the other side of that line, the opposite construct that the third one had was the argument was adequate. And we repeated that with lots of different combinations, and in fact 5 different assignments gives 10 different combinations. And then after they'd said excellent argument and argument adequate, we said, okay, for each of the 5, can you say if argument excellent is 1 and argument adequate is 5, what would you say for the other 5 assignments? So we were trying to get them to sort of rate all of the 5 assignments against the construct that they had come up with. It wasn't something that we gave them. And then at the end, on the right-hand side where it says priority, that column, we asked them to rank these different constructs in terms of importance for them in their marking. And along the bottom, finally, we asked them to say roughly what kind of grade they'd give. So you can see that this tutor gave A a first, that's a high distinction or an A. Low to 1 C grade, that is a low C or a low merit, I think, in the Australian context. 5960 is borderline merit distinction. So that was the process we did. Now, in general, and some people may have seen this before, what we discovered was that we didn't, when we were doing the analysis, we didn't pay too much attention to the actual marks they'd given, because we were aware, and they were very aware, that without wider context, knowing how the students had been taught, knowing more about the curriculum, they weren't very comfortable giving those marks. So we were more interested in how they ranked the different assignments, the quality of them. And what we found was that the only one of the piece of work, which is in the bottom right-hand corner there, was actually ranked, was assigned the same or similar rank by all of the assessors. So that was, this is the E assignment for the history, was ranked at first or joint first, second by all the examiners between them. Everything else was ranked at least more than 2 apart, and nearly half, 9 out of 20, was ranked by both by examiners as either both the best assignment of the 5 they've been given and the worst. So there actually didn't seem to be an awful lot of consistency in their views about the quality of the student work. And you might say to me, well, it's not surprising if you gave them very borderline work. But if I go to the next slide, you'll see that if you look at the bottom box of the next slide, this is the history examiners, the range of marks they gave. You can see that they weren't seeing them as borderline 2, and the range of marks for most people was at least 3 grades, A to B, C, A to D. The reason I've highlighted some in red there, because it tended to show that rather than some markers being tougher markers and or easier markers, they seem to differ in the amount of the range that they were prepared to use. So the red people made less of a use of the full range of marks, which I think is something we probably know intuitively goes on. So there was this general inconsistency in thinking about the students. So we decided to do this case analysis of one subject area to try and look more closely at the use of constructs by the examiners, to try and understand where the differences seem to come. And on this slide, I've just shown really that the history examiners had similar inconsistency in their marking. They had a range of marks for each essay. They had a range of ranks for each essay in the top 2 slides. So there was a lot of inconsistency between them. The reason we chose history for our analysis is because they tended to use more common constructs than other people. At least 6 constructs were used by 4 examiners. Okay, so what we found when we looked at the constructs for the historians was that the overall agreement on marks, which came through for some of them, was really masked considerable variability in the actual criteria they'd used. which was quite interesting. And so we looked at why that might be. So these five reasons we think for why criteria are open to multiple sort of interpretations, or have multiple problems. The first one was when we looked at the constructs that the examiners came up with, the things they noticed in student work. So in a sense, the things they noticed are their implicit criteria for judging. Now, we did give them sets of criteria to look at, but when they actually did the KRG, the Kelly's Repertory Grid technique, the historians came up with, I think, 17 different criteria. And only 7 of those actually related to the ones that we supplied them with. Now, you could say that obviously is part of the research technique. It encouraged them to notice things rather than told them to mark against a specific set of criteria, although we did give them to them. What it suggests to me, though, is that assessors might be consciously or unconsciously drawing on a longer list of criteria than those that are published to students or to their colleagues, and that's quite interesting itself. See, in my view, none of those that are listed there would look amiss in a set of criteria for an history essay. But generally speaking, we have to choose a limited number. We don't like to give students 17 criteria. But perhaps more are being used than are actually listed to students. The other thing is that in using these criteria, we may not actually be conscious of all sources of judgment. There have been a couple of studies that have shown, for example, how heavily influenced people are by students' presentation. Studied by Hartley, which has also been done by someone else whose name just escapes me, found that use of font size could impact on students' marks by as much as 1 whole grade boundary, with the bigger bigger font attracting higher marks than the smaller font. And I think most examiners, most assessors wouldn't be aware of that influence on them. So that was the first reason, that we're using different criteria to those that are published, or more than those that are published. The second reason is that perhaps assessors have different understanding of shared criteria. Now again, obviously these tables are a bit tricky to unpick, but here we're talking about a construct that all the historians came up with, which was to do with historiography. And if you look at the bottom of the slide, you can see how they defined it. So examiner 1 had engages well with historiography on one end, hardly engages with it at the other end, and likewise going down. So we were interested to see how the different assessors, looking at the construct of historiography, how similarly they graded the students. And if you look at SAB, you could see on historiography, the assessor 1 gave it 1 for very, engages well with historiography, whereas assessor 3 actually put it nearer to unawareness of historiography. And similarly with some of the others I've highlighted, there's an awful lot of variability between them. So although the same language is being used, historiography, people's sort of nuanced understanding of that term seems to mean that they give students different grading in relation to it. Now, you could argue that actually if you look at the full construct used by the examiners, there is slightly different. Particularly if you look at the right-hand side, so examiner 2 down the bottom there says historiography determined equals less determined at one end, less determined by historiography on the right-hand side, and other ones are slightly different. Now, which may explain why they've given different gradings to the students. However, do we and can we express that nuanced difference in understanding to students and to our fellow assessors through our description of our criteria? And there's another one here with which is using the construct of argumentation. Again, there's some variability. I particularly picked up SAD there, which had some consistency among some of the examiners, who all gave it a 4. But then if we look at examiner 5, they thought it was different. They gave it a 2. And in fact, examiners 5, if you look along that row, you'll see they rank things very differently to all the other assessors in relation to this. Now, does that mean that they have a completely different understanding of argument? Fine. However, when we use the term argument in a criterion, do all the different parties actually use it in the same way? Probably not. What was interesting when in the interviews that followed this up is that these assessors did think that they had the same standards as other people, even though looking at how they ranked the criterion, it seemed that there were differences in their understanding. I'm just going to stop there for a minute to see if anybody is interested in asking a question or making a point about what I've been talking about with these first couple of reasons why I think there are ways that we interpret criteria differently.
So just so you know, you can scroll up the chat box on the left-hand side to see the history as well.
Right. Okay. Thank you. All right. Okay. I've gone a bit too far up. Someone, Ellen McIntyre, has said, does a glossary of terminology help? We'll discuss that a little bit at the end. My feeling is that the more I got into this, the more I realized that to actually cover all the different aspects of what you want people to apply in relation to criteria means that that glossary of terminology might end up being the works of Shakespeare. That's a slight exaggeration, but very difficult to capture all the different things that people have to think about in marking. Yes, Natalie's mentioned that there's the issue of how students interpret the criteria, yeah, and that is really, really important because obviously the whole idea is, one of the whole ideas is to make it more transparent to students. Then we need to make sure that they also aren't having multiple understandings. Did Assessor 5 understand the scoring? This is Anthony Carter. Well, I have to say we practiced this research methods and sat in and watched the researchers in doing it and tried to make sure they did. And I have no evidence to suggest they didn't, but obviously, as with all research, that is an issue. Carol said this should be picked up by a moderator. Absolutely. However, let's just think about what the job a moderator has to do and their own set of standards, what they bring to it. Short of remarking them all and having a discussion. I think it's, I'm very nervous actually about what we can ask from moderation, but we can, people think about that. Bill's asked, are these double-blind marked? No, we just asked them to look at them themselves. Where they came from, they possibly had been double-blind marked. We're not certain. Someone else has raised the moderation issue, and I will, in the last part, try and talk more about the moderation issue. Okay. Right. I'm going to, someone's talked here about possibly having marked exemplars for each grade level. Would it be helpful for the examiners to achieve consistency? That kind of pre-marking activity we'll have a talk about. I'm going to move on now then. Thanks very much for those questions, and I'll try and keep my eye on them. Okay. Reason 3 was assessors have a different sense of appropriate standards for each criterion. So here we are with the historians looking at 3 of them who, as you can see there, had very similar gradings for each on the construct of argument, very similar gradings for each of the assignments for the most part, except for E. I don't know what it was about E. However, when we look at how they describe argument on the left-hand side, you can see that they describe them quite differently. Assessor 1 describes the quality of the argument as excellent, so they're saying A has excellent argument. If we look down at Assessor 4, they're only describing it as reasonable argument. So an argument focus, well, it's not quite sure what that might be, somewhere in between. Or so in a sense, even where people are seeing that students have argument in there, there's a different view of what constitutes the standards, what constitutes excellent, what constitutes reasonable. So that tends to reinforce the research, prior research, that people have a different sense of appropriate standards for each criterion. Okay. The 4th reason is that the constructs or criteria are complex in themselves. So that although we might, for example, in this case, the construct was structure, we might offer the students a criteria that the assignment must be well structured. When we started to look at how the lecturers looked at structure, we found that there was some variety. So just looking at those two red ovals that I put there, Assessors 4 and 6 thought that SA, C, D, and E were similar in relation to structure, but they had very different views, or reasonably different views, about SAA and to a certain extent on SAB, which seems strange. But when we looked at it, we wondered whether the understanding of structure, as described in their construct, was slightly different, and that was visible in SAA and B and not in the other 3. So, for example, the construct by Assessor 4 was extremely well structured to not so well structured, whereas the construct for Assessor 6 was clear structure and signposting to jumps in with no signposting. So maybe that issue of signposting is an extra element to structure that isn't always used by others. And if I go to the next slide, if we look at the different ways people talked about structure, logical, analytical, thematic structure, balanced in level of attention, effective structure, extremely well structured, clear structure, that we might put the structure of an assignment in the assessment criteria, but in practice it might actually mask several sub criteria about the nature of the structure. So the complexity of criteria themselves might well be masked by the way we write of them and hidden to view to both ourselves and to students. Okay. And then the last one was that assessors value and weight differently in their judgment. So if you remember right back at the beginning, at the end of the Kelly's repertoire, we asked people to rank what they thought were the most important criteria, and we found that the only consistency in the ranking of the criteria, or the constructs, was related to lower ranks for surface constructs. By surface constructs, we mean things like the technical detail, referencing, grammar, English, presentation. People tend to think they were less important than the global constructs, which refer to the substantive content or sort of conceptual organization of the assignment. But otherwise, people were really variable in what they thought was important. So for the historians, some saw structure as really important and ranked it 1, some ranked it as 5. Same with historiography. Some ranked it as high as 2, others ranked it halfway down their list. And for academic style, the rank ranged between 1 and 10. So assessors appear to value and weight different criteria in their judgments. And And again, this might be happening consciously or unconsciously. As I said before, research has shown that presentation seems to really affect people's judgment, although they may not be aware of how importantly they see it. And in practice, probably all these 5 different criteria that I've been talking about will have some sort of impact on, they'll act together to impact on the different ways that people make their judgment. I'm slightly distracted here. Renee has asked if she could make a contribution would you like to, Renee?
My microphone's really bad, but I posted my question in the chat.
Okay. Well, I can hear you. Do you want to say it anyway? Oh, she's gone. Question. Okay, Renee, I've got your question in the chat. In relation to the values, did they rank these in relation to what learning outcomes objectives were associated with the assessment? I think that, well, in a sense, in relation to the values, question in relation to the values, did they rank these? They were given the criteria, but they were just asked to rank their own, what they had noticed themselves. So they weren't asked to rank the criteria they were given. They weren't necessarily given the learning outcomes. We just gave them the assignments and the criteria. Now, it could be, of course, if people have more information, then they may rank them differently and other things may become more important. I don't know if that's any help. Obviously, this is experimental design, and in that sense, there are some limitations. Nikki's asked, how well designed were these assessments with regard to learning outcomes goals for the course? Again, it would be difficult for us to say. We sourced the assignments from reputable universities. Of course, all UK universities are reputable universities of the UK. They'd been agreed by external examiners and internal validation. Having said that, we all know that some assessments can be weaker than others. What we did do was choose assignments that were typical for their subject area. And to be honest, I don't think any of the examiners particularly commented on the weakness of the assessment design. I'm just looking to see whether we've other questions that have cropped up at this point. Right. How detailed were these criteria? They weren't terribly detailed. I suppose that was purposeful. We just took some standard criteria for those subject areas, general history essay criteria, and you could say we could make them very detailed, but my view is, having looked at all this, these different ways that people can interpret criteria, we may well have to, as I said before, write small works of Shakespeare. In order to actually try to make explicit all the differences in what we're looking for, and to really pin down things. And in that pinning down, we probably make the assignment, we probably limit students' originality, we probably limit students' independence of thought, because we almost tell them to exactly how to do it. Right. I'm just looking at other things. Here's some discussion questions. The people have been asking questions about the research. Let's look at the bullet point 2 there. Let's have a poll, shall we? Should we recognize the impossibility of a right mark in the case of complex assignments? In other words, do we really think that we can actually narrow it down so that we can give students an accurate right mark? A couple of people think we can. I'd be interested to see if either of those would like to make a comment. Oh, there's 3 people now. I think we can. You see, I'm probably too cynical about this. I think anybody would like to make a comment about the right mark? Oops, I'm struggling to keep up with the comments now. Renee said, do I mean right as in correct? Yes, I do mean right as in correct. Is there actually a correct mark for a complex, for an assignment, for example, an essay? Bill has asked whether anyone has shown a nomogram for distribution of grading the same set of essays. I'm afraid I don't know what a nomogram is. Supportive guidance in developing students' ability to assess, self-assess is showing some signs of success, but the scaffolding is really important. I agree with that. I'm just going to push on now because the hour is zooming up. Let's just talk about that last point there. What are the implications for fairness, standards and guidance to students? In work I've been doing with a couple of Australians, Lenore A.D., who I think has just moved universities. I should know where she's gone, and Claire Hughes. We'll be looking at this issue of moderation and how we might be more effective in actually getting agreement over the standards with students, with staff and students. And one of the things we wonder is whether we ought to be what we call flipping the assessment cycle. So instead of moderating at the end, which is often done under incredible pressure of time by the moderators, that maybe it's better to emphasize pre-teaching moderation, and that might be, as someone said before, looking at exemplars and discussing them, perhaps the work of students in the last cohort. And it seems that might have some really good benefits in terms of getting people thinking more closely about the assessment design, and did it actually give people the opportunity to actually express the learning we wanted them to. It also may inform teaching if people have had to think really and discuss what it is that they want students to learn from them and demonstrate in their assessment, that might inform the teaching. It also may inform dialogue with students. One of the things that comes up in satisfaction surveys, etc., is that students complain that perhaps teachers give different guidance for the same assignment, or they have different standards. Now, if the tutors or the teachers have discussed the standards in advance, maybe the dialogue they have with students is likely to be more consistency. Also, there is the opportunity, that kind of social process that allows for we think allows for the development of shared standards amongst the teaching team, and therefore improve consistency of marking judgments. I have to say, we'll come on to examples of that. There is some emerging research showing that it is that social process of talking about standards within them amongst academics that actually can go some way to improving consistency in a way that published criteria don't do. And if we were to do that way round, then I think that at the end of the course, the moderation could just focus on really important things, the very high stakes items, the very borderline work, and do that well, rather than try to moderate everything. These kind of social processes, they are beginning to emerge in quality requirements for higher education. For example, the UK Quality Code, which is something that the universities are required to demonstrate that they apply, now says that practices which promote and support consistency of marking by and between staff, including dialogues which enable a shared understanding, should be is an indicator of good practice. So there is evidence that social processes are beginning to be expected. It's not entirely unrelated to myself and Sally Brown and a couple of people being on the group that wrote these, but there we are. There is an example, I don't know whether Mark Freeman or other colleagues who are involved in the Achievement Matters project in Australia, but there's a good example, I think, where bringing academics together to take part in calibration activities, which essentially seemed to me to be about really thrashing out what they were looking for, the validity of the task and the of the marking, actually did have an impact in decreasing the variability in academics' judgment. So we do have some evidence. We need a lot more evidence. We need to spend a lot more time on this in order to really test out whether this is a better use of our time than spending a lot of time with assessment criteria. The other thing is, in talking about students and helping students, my view is that we should really be working on the way we learn our standards. We should think about helping students learn them in that way, rather than thinking that they can learn standards just from telling them, either by writing it down or standing up in front of them and telling them. And looking at the way we've learned standards and the research on the way we've learned our standards, these are some of the components I think we need to think about. One is that we help students to, we emphasize the holistic judgment process. Research shows that in general, well, and again, we need more research on this, people tend to come up with the overall judgment of a piece of work rather than judgment on specific criteria. They then may track in writing their feedback or filling in a grid to individual criteria. But it's helping students think about what are they trying to do with this assignment, rather than have I hit that criterion, that criterion, that criterion, which often doesn't, well, as Jill Miller talks about, they end up painting their assignments by numbers and not really understanding what they're supposed to be learning. We learn through real judgments. We learn through actually doing marking. We don't learn through being told how to do it. Doing it and by dialogue about it. So we, as a novice marker, we mark, we talk to senior colleagues or mentors or moderators about our marking, about what the marks should be. So we learn through being part of that community. And we learn over time. So we don't learn by just once being told what the criterion are or how to do it. And again, I think it's something, we're working with students, we need to give them multiple opportunities to practice marking. And of course, peer assessment, low stakes peer assessment is a really good opportunity to do that. The last couple of bullets there I think are also important. That I think a lot of people are nervous about this, and it's something people might want to comment on, but I think we should help students understand the nature of complex judgment, that there aren't necessarily right answers, although one or two people disagree with that. It's just, in a sense, it's a bit like going to the doctor, getting a second opinion. Professional judgment has to often make a decision in the light of not all the data, or some data where there isn't clear conclusions. So helping students understand the nature of that, but that in the context of university assessment, where they're assessed multiple times with multiple assessors, overall we come out with a reasonably fair response for them. Lastly, there's some work done by Bell and colleagues, that's another Australian researcher, showed that if students see knowledge as contestable, if they recognize that there are different ways of expressing things, that there isn't necessarily a right answer in lots of contexts, then they're more comfortable with assessment criteria. They see them as general guidance. If the students think that knowledge is fixed, then they actually become quite critical of assessment criteria and want more and more detailed criteria, which of course I think it becomes difficult to produce. So helping our students think about knowledge, think about how that knowledge is created, is a good idea. So I'll just conclude, and then we'll see if anybody wants to have a look at what people are saying. I think this study provides empirical support for the previous research, and as O'Hagan and Wigglesworth said, who marks your essay can become more important than the content of the essay itself. I think that's a bit scary, but again, I have some faith in the fact that we do have students have many, many different markers and many different assignments. I think the 5 reasons why people might interpret criteria differently, I like to work in combination, making it very complex to unpick. I really do not think that more detailed criteria is the answer. I just think it's impossible to write down in something like an essay or a complex assignment that students are asked to do, to write all the possible nuances of what we're looking for. And I also think it really will limit originality and independent thought. So should we be emphasizing social processes? Should we stop striving for right marks, but actually talk about the multiple assessors? And do we share this nature of professional judgment with students? Should we actually let them know that marking is a slightly, it's not a science, it's more of an art. So there's my conclusions. I'm just looking down. Chris said we need to get as close as possible. Various people. I think it depends on the number of students involved too. Yes, although there have been some really interesting pieces of work. Chris Rust and colleagues at Oxford Brookes working with 500 students managed to do activities which improve their understanding of standards and consequently improve their grades by between the group, the control group and the other group by about 1 grade on average for a whole year. So I think you can work with high numbers of students. Yeah, there'll always be variation. If we have students carry out marking themselves, they'll realize the variability is part of the natural process. I absolutely agree with that. I absolutely agree with that. And I do think, going back to the slide on learning the way tutors learn, that it's doing this, working with real judgments, having a dialogue about it, seeing how their marking compares with the tutor, that helps learn. I'm just looking at what other people. If we can't, then what are we doing assessing using these rubrics? Jolly good question in my view. We're all doing it, and the quality people want us to do it because we all have a kind of blind faith in them. And I think it's too frightening to in a sense, to lots of people not to have that. On the other hand, rubrics, if they're used as a basis for discussion of what we're looking for, I think can be helpful both with students and staff. But we need to be aware that they're just helpful general guidance and they don't tell us everything. Yeah. Should we still have the goal of the right mark, Ellen asks. It's tricky, isn't it? It's really tricky. Julia says, isn't it more about justifying the mark given? I think that's a good, a useful point, really. Explain to students why you think it's the mark that you've given, rather than actually saying that this is the exact mark that everybody else would give. Yeah, other people talking about the subjectivity of the examiner. Yeah, somebody, let me just see who it is. Jane has talked about students' degree classification. That's the award they get at the end is awarded over at least a 2-year assessment period, so they get right grade in the end. And I agree with that. In general, I think that is the is what happens if there's lots and lots of different marks, that they then tend to merge into the one that is appropriate for the student. And that's what we need to be saying to students, I think, rather than trying to moderate every single assignment to get the right mark. I'm aware that it's gone 8 o'clock here, so I'll shut up for a minute. I'm just going to put the reference slides up so that they're recorded for anybody who wants to follow up any of the references in here. And the feedback slide there. Matthew, I'll finish there. Obviously, there's lots of other comments that I haven't been able to respond to. I apologise for that.
That's fine. Thanks, Sue. Yeah, I'm just copying and pasting in the feedback link for people. Please feel free to keep hanging around if people want to. You don't have to leave if you don't want to. We're not kicking you out or anything. So, but yes, if you do need to go, that's fine. The recording will be posted in the next few days. I will send an email around, so if you have registered for our newsletter, when you signed up to our platform, then you will get the message that says the recording is now available. So thanks all, and thanks Sue. I'm going to stop the recording here. Thank you very much for a very interesting and very stimulating discussion.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye to everyone.